What I want to talk about is focus on two classic areas, and I'm going to use the classic terms for them. One is in the front of the brain, and is called Broca's area. Another is in the back of the brain, and it's called Wernicke's area. And we know from work on speech that Broca's area is important for speech production. There's other functions that go along with that region as well, but we know it's involved in speech production. And this region is involved in comprehension. Now what's interesting is that where these areas are with respect to sensory and motor regions of the brain. So if you look at where the motor face area is, it's right next to the speech production region, or Broca's area. And auditory cortex is right next to Wernicke's cortex. So this raises an interesting question about whether the brain organization, these two regions, come about because of the input-output systems for speech, because speech uses the lips and tongues for articulation, it's perceived auditorily. So we can look at sign languages to try to answer this question a little bit, because for sign languages, of course, you use the hands and arms. And the motor region that controls the hands and the arms isn't in the same place. It's more superior. It's in a different place. And sign languages are, of course, not perceived auditorily, but they're perceived visually. And the visual cortex is in the back of the brain, far from auditory cortex. So our question is, are these two regions involved in sign language production and comprehension? Okay, so let's start with looking at language output, so sign versus word production. And I'm going to tell you about a study that was a meta-study, actually taking a number of different experiments on word production and sign production and combining them and then doing a comparison. And I want to point out that people in these experiments have been native ASL signers. What this means is that they were born into deaf families and have deaf parents and learned sign language very early. And we use this group of people in our studies because they're comparable with the hearing people who also they're born into English-speaking families and get exposed to their language very early. So we want to compare groups that get language exposure very early. And what these participants were asked to do was to simply name pictures. So this was either a sign production or a word production task. You would see pictures and produce them. And the method that we use is called positron emission tomography, or PET. And it basically measures blood flow in the brain. So when neurons are active, they need energy, and so you get blood flow towards that region of the brain. And so we can tell that that region of the brain is engaged in the task you're asking them to do. And in all of these brain studies that I'm going to be telling you about today, we will be comparing our target task with a baseline task, a task that we use to sort of subtract out or to get rid of activation that's just due to seeing something or making a decision. So in some of these tasks, it's a simple task where you have a face and it's either upright or upside down, and you decide yes, no, it's upright or upside down. So you have visual information in both, you have a decision in both, but in one you're retrieving a lexical item, you're retrieving a word or a sign, and the other one you're not, because these are unfamiliar faces. Okay, so our basic question was to look to see whether the same areas of the brain, or what are the areas of the brain that are engaged or active for both sign production and for word production. Okay? So in this analysis, what we saw was, we'll focus here on Broca's area. It was equally active for both sign production and word production. So what this tells us is that this region is not specifically tied to the speech articulators. So despite the fact that it's right in front of the region that controls the mouth and the lips, and despite the fact that there's actually connections between that area and auditory cortex, we still see that this region plays an important role in the production of sign languages that are produced with the hands. Okay? So what about the other area, the Wernicke's area? Well, we don't have a large meta-study that compares lots of studies, But this is some examples of studies that have looked at sign language comprehension in a number of different sign languages, British Sign Language and Quebec Sign Language and American Sign Language. And remember, you're perceiving a visual language, you're watching a signer, and yet we still see activation in this region that's near auditory cortex. So what that suggests, again, is that Wernicke's area is not a speech comprehension area, and it's not tied to auditory speech processing. It's involved in language comprehension, regardless of whether that language is spoken or signed. And I'll mention one other finding that's relevant to comprehension and processing, and that is that, well, actually, let me go this way. Now we're looking at the structure of the brain, so not the function. We compare the gray matter, that is where the cells are and the supporting cells are, in auditory cortex for congenitally deaf individuals and hearing individuals. And one region, Heschel's gyrus, that's the area of the brain that's often called primary auditory cortex. It's where the first region in the cortex that receives sound signals. And when we compare the size of Heschel's gyrus in deaf and hearing people, there's no difference. So gray matter the cells don't atrophy and die in auditory cortex. And the same is true if we look a little further along in superior temporal cortex, which overlaps with Wernicke's area. We again find no difference in gray matter between deaf and hearing individuals. So one possibility, this cortex is still active in part because it's processing visual information, including sign language. Okay? So auditory regions don't disappear for deaf individuals. They become used for other processes. Okay, so if we come back to my sort of title question, is brain organization for language determined by the input-output systems? What sign languages tell us is no. These two kind of classic areas for comprehension and production are also involved and play critical roles in sign language production and comprehension. So the brain seems to be organized for language, not for speech. So if we come back to my question, what determines it? Well, not the anatomy of the motor and sensory systems. But I don't want you to leave here thinking, I would be very remiss if you left here thinking that those are the only two areas that are involved in language processing. Language processing is very complex, is a complex system. This is a recent model that's just for speech perception, okay? And we're now just beginning to sort of tease apart whether aspects of this complex system, all of the different aspects apply to sign, are they speech specific or not, okay? So we're just at the beginnings of trying to understand whether these kinds of complex models apply to sign languages as well. Okay. So let me come to my last question, which is whether the neural substrates, that is the neural support for language and gesture production, are they different? And we get this question because unlike words, signs can actually resemble the gesture to action. So this is again this distinctive aspect of iconicity that you find in sign languages that you don't see in spoken languages much. So in spoken language, the word scrub has nothing to do with the action of scrubbing, or the verb drink doesn't. But as I'll show you, these verbs in American Sign Language and probably in Spanish Sign Language as well look very much like the actions that they denote. So these particular verb types that exhibit what I call sort of sensory motor iconicity, this pantomimic type iconicity, are called handling verbs in ASL. So I want to tell you about two studies that investigated the neural representation for these types of verbs. the first study where we compared these handling or pantomimic verbs versus verbs that didn't exhibit this type of iconicity. And the second one was a direct comparison between verb production and pantomime production. So the first study, again, we used positron emission tomography. One reason we use this technique is it is sensitive or less sensitive to movement. So you can actually move quite a bit in the scanner. And so we're asking signers to move a lot and to produce signs or pantomimes, or in this case, signs. And what signers in this experiment were asked to do was, it's again a picture naming task where we showed them pictures and we asked them to produce the signs for those pictures. But before I tell you about what we found for the sign production, I need to tell you something about what regions we know are involved in pantomime production from hearing individuals. So when hearing people are asked to pantomime, what areas of the brain are involved? And one region that seems to be involved, in addition to others, is the superior parietal cortex. This is at the very top of the brain in the left hemisphere. Okay, so this comes from experiments where you ask people to produce different kinds of tool use pantomimes. Okay, how do you use a tool, for example? Okay. So our hypotheses, given what I've told you already about word production and sign production and pantomime production, you can think about if these pantomimic type signs pattern like pantomime, okay, if they're more like pantomime because you're using those kinds of motor information, then they should look like pantomimes in the brain. We should see greater activation for those types of signs in the superior parietal lobule in SPL. Now, if pantomime signs pattern more like spoken words, then we should see activation in this Broca's area. So when hearing people were asked to pantomime, they don't show activation in Broca's area. And similarly, well, actually, let me leave it there. So, so that's the basic idea. Do these verbs pattern like pantomimes? Do they pattern like verbs that we see in spoken languages? So signers were shown pictures like this, and they were asked to produce the sign for the picture. Okay, and here's some examples of what the signs look like for each picture. Okay, now we compared the production of these types of verbs with actions that didn't involve any kind of handling, any kind of tool or implement. Okay, so here were pictures that elicited those types of verbs. Oops, there we go. Okay. So the idea here is if the pantomimic type verbs, like the hammer example, if those, or the race example, if those verbs are really verbs in the sense that you're retrieving a phonological form, you're retrieving a hand shape and a location and a movement, and you're assembling them together, then they should look very much like these verbs, okay? So if the hand shape in the handling classifier verbs is really part of the phonological form, then both verb types should look similar. You're retrieving hand shapes, locations, and movements for both verb types. On the other hand, if you're doing something different with these handling verbs, then these two verb types should look different. Okay. So what did we find? No difference. We found that both the pantomimic type verbs and the non-pantomimic verbs, so the handling verbs and the non-handling verbs, looked identical. They both engaged Broca's area. Okay. So this is very similar to the type of activation that we see when we ask English speakers, for example, to do the same task, to produce English verbs for those pictures. But But what about when we directly compare the two? When we directly compare the two, we don't see any differences in activation. So you might think for the handling verbs, if they're really engaging pantomimic type regions, we should see more activation up here in this superior parietal region, but we don't see that. So what this suggests is that the brain is treating these verbs as verbs. The brain's not treating them as pantomimes. You see activation related to language, not to pantomime. So what